There's a very specific kind of fantasy drama that doesn't just want you to watch power unfold. It wants you to feel the humiliation that came before it. The years of swallowing anger. The silence in rooms where somebody brilliant is treated like furniture because the wrong body happened to carry the talent. And the daughter who commands dragon understands that feeling so well that by the time Eleanor finally stops asking for permission and starts taking space instead, the entire show changes temperature. Seriously, you can feel it. The air of the thing gets heavier, meaner, colder. Like the series itself has finally decided to stop kneeling. And honestly, that's what hooked me so hard about this show on Flick Flare. Not the dragons, not even the magic. It's the resentment underneath all of it. And yeah, before we go further, moderate spoilers here. I'm not going to blow every late reveal apart scene by scene, but this is absolutely one of those stories where the emotional trajectory matters more than the surprise itself. So we are talking about major character turns and the overall direction. Also, if you end up liking this kind of long-form drama breakdown, subscribe. Soft pitch. No hostage situation. We are all adults here. What I didn't expect from this series is how patient it is with suffering. A lot of fantasy revenge stories rush humiliation because they're desperate to get to the cool part. They treat pain like a loading screen before empowerment. This show lingers in it, sometimes uncomfortably long. Eleanor isn't introduced as some untouchable chosen one standing dramatically on a cliff while CGI storms swirl behind her. No, she's born gifted into a world that immediately decides her gift doesn't belong to her. That difference matters because it changes the emotional architecture of everything afterward. The tragedy isn't that she lacks power. The tragedy is that everybody around her recognizes she has it and builds systems specifically designed to deny it. That's a much uglier kind of cruelty. And the show understands ugliness in this really grounded way. The family scenes early on are almost harder to watch than the battlefield moments later because they're so intimate. The dismissals aren't theatrical. They're casual, generational, embedded into daily life. Little glances across dinner tables. Conversations ending when she enters a room. Decisions being made around her instead of with her. The script never over-explains the misogyny either, which weirdly makes it feel more real. Nobody stands up and gives speeches about women being lesser. They just behave like the hierarchy is gravity itself. Fixed, natural, not worth questioning. Then her sister gets sacrificed into that marriage, and the whole emotional center of the story sharpens into something painful enough to carry the entire season. Because here's the thing, the daughter who commands dragon is technically a fantasy epic, but emotionally it behaves more like a family tragedy. The dragons are almost secondary to inheritance, to legacy, to the violence families commit in the name of survival. Eleanor's sister being handed over like political currency is one of the first moments where the show quietly tells you nobody is coming to save these women. And the way it shoots those scenes is devastatingly restrained. No swelling music begging you to cry. No exaggerated villain monologues. Just this suffocating inevitability. Silk dresses, tight jawlines, dead eyes pretending to smile. There's a shot I can't get out of my head where Eleanor watches her sister prepare for the ceremony and the camera stays behind Eleanor instead of showing us the full room. You mostly see fragments in reflection. Gold threading, flickering candlelight, servants adjusting fabric. And all the sound feels muted except breathing. It feels like someone dissociating in real time. That scene told me more about Eleanor's psychology than 3 episodes of exposition could have. And wait, because this matters later. The show keeps tying power to witnessing, who is allowed to observe history versus who is forced to endure it silently. Eleanor remembers everything. That becomes terrifying once she finally has the ability to act on those memories. The mother storyline absolutely wrecked me too. Not in a melodramatic way, in a slow erosion kind of way. Her mother enslaving herself to preserve what little remains of the family's survival is framed almost like a practical decision, which somehow makes it even more horrifying. There's no triumphant sacrifice music, no grand declaration, just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from years of compromise slowly eating your identity alive. And the actress playing the mother, unbelievable restraint. Seriously, there's one scene where she's speaking to Eleanor about survival, and she keeps smoothing wrinkles out of fabric while talking. That's it. Tiny physical acting choice. But her hands never stop moving because the character herself cannot stop managing damage. Cannot stop trying to hold together structures already collapsing around her. That kind of performance detail is all over this show. Actually, the acting in general is much smarter than I expected from a dragon fantasy series with a title that sounds this aggressively dramatic. And I say that with affection because the daughter who commands dragon absolutely sounds like something that could have gone full camp disaster if handled poorly. But the cast grounds it. Eleanor especially. The performance choice that makes Eleanor work is that she doesn't become instantly confident once her power awakens. That would have been the easy version. Instead, she becomes dangerous before she becomes emotionally stable. Huge difference. When the Archmage takes her away and begins opening the door toward forbidden magic, the show shifts into something colder and stranger. Not triumphant. Not inspirational. Almost predatory. I loved that. The hidden sanctuary where Eleanor trains has this decaying sacredness to it. Moss-covered stone corridors. Ancient chambers lit by low blue fire. Dust floating through shafts of light, like the building itself remembers dead civilizations. The production design suddenly leans into loneliness instead of oppression. And that distinction matters because Eleanor's suffering changes shape there. Back home she was denied. Here she is isolated. Revered, maybe. Feared, definitely. But isolated. And the Archmage himself, fascinating character because the show refuses to simplify his motives. He rescues her, yes, but not cleanly. There's always this lingering uncertainty around whether he sees Eleanor as a person or as a historical event waiting to happen. The mentorship dynamic never becomes emotionally safe. And thank God for that, because fantasy stories are way too addicted to wise old mentor purity. Here, every lesson feels transactional, dangerous, like he's unlocking doors he himself may no longer control. Some of the magic scenes are stunning too, not because they're huge, but because they feel forbidden. The visual language changes whenever Eleanor taps deeper into her abilities. Sound dampens, colors desaturate slightly. The camera starts lingering a fraction too long on expressions. The show creates this sense that reality itself resents what she's doing. One sequence where she accidentally fractures part of a chamber wall while practicing honestly gave me chills because nobody reacts immediately. There's just silence. Dust drifting through the air. Then the Archmage slowly looks up with something that is not pride. Fear. That's the moment the series quietly tells you Eleanor may not become a hero in the traditional sense. And I know some viewers wanted her to stay morally pure longer, but honestly, I think the show becomes richer because it resists that temptation. Revenge changes people, especially revenge rooted in systemic humiliation. Eleanor doesn't just want justice. She wants reversal. She wants the world reordered. Those are not the same thing. There's a scene midway through the training arc where she asks why power was forbidden to women if magic supposedly serves balance. And the Archmage pauses before answering long enough that you realize the truth before he says it. Because balance threatens whoever sits comfortably above it. Such a simple line, but it reframes the entire social structure of the series. Magic isn't feared because it corrupts women. Women are restricted because unrestricted magic would collapse the hierarchy. That idea echoes through everything afterward. Also, can we talk about the dragons for a second? Because I was nervous. Fantasy television has trained me to lower expectations anytime giant creatures are involved unless the budget looks like a small nation's GDP. But the dragons here are used intelligently, sparingly. The show understands anticipation. You hear them before you fully see them. Wings in distant storms, low growls vibrating through stone corridors, brief silhouettes against mountain fog. Instead of shoving CGI creatures into every other frame screaming, "Look how expensive we are," the series builds mythology around presence. So when Eleanor finally establishes that first true connection, man, that entire sequence is incredible. No heroic music at first, just brutal weather, rain hammering black cliffs, Eleanor standing there exhausted, bleeding slightly from one hand after a failed ritual. The dragon emerging through fog isn't framed like a triumphant pet reveal either. It feels ancient, angry. The sound design here deserves awards honestly because the creature doesn't roar immediately. You hear this deep layered inhale first, like a furnace waking up. And Eleanor looks terrified. That's what makes it work. She doesn't step forward like Destiny's favorite child. She freezes. Because for all her rage, for all her ambition, the reality of standing before something that powerful still hits her with raw animal fear. The dragon lowers its head just enough for one eye to fill the frame, and the lighting flickers across its scales in this dark metallic shimmer while rainwater pours off every edge of its face. Then Eleanor reaches out, tiny gesture, shaking hand, and the score finally swells, not into victory, but into something mournful. Like the world realizing a line has just been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. That scene right there sold the entire show to me. Because the connection between Eleanor and the dragons never feels cute or sanitized. It feels mutually dangerous. Like both sides recognize violence in the other. There's respect there, but also volatility. The dragons aren't horses with wings. They're forces. And Eleanor increasingly starts resembling one emotionally. Isolated, territorial, wounded, capable of enormous destruction when cornered. You know what else surprised me? The pacing. This show takes risks with silence. Modern fantasy series are often terrified you'll get bored unless somebody dies every 14 minutes or delivers a mem-ready monologue for social media edits. But the daughter who commands dragon trusts atmosphere. Entire scenes breathe. Sometimes characters sit with decisions instead of immediately explaining them. Sometimes resentment hangs in the room unanswered. That patience gives later explosions real weight. Because when Eleanor finally returns home and finds her house broken, the emotional payoff lands like a hammer precisely because the show invested so heavily in memory. The kneeling air moment could have been cheesy in another series. Here it feels almost spiritually ugly. Not satisfying exactly. More complicated than that. The air kneels, yes, but the camera keeps cutting back to Eleanor's face and there's barely triumph there. Mostly disbelief. Rage that survived too long. Grief calcified into identity. The show understands a really uncomfortable truth about revenge stories. Sometimes the fantasy you built in your head for years finally happens, and it still doesn't restore what was taken from you. That emotional contradiction carries the second half of the series in such an interesting direction, because Eleanor starts winning externally while deteriorating internally. And honestly, some viewers are going to hate that. I can already see the debates. People wanting cleaner empowerment, cleaner morality, cleaner catharsis. But personally, I think the messiness is exactly why the show lingers in your head afterward. There's one conversation later between Eleanor and a surviving member of her household that hit me harder than some of the giant action scenes. He tells her the family feared what she might become, and she responds very quietly, "You made becoming necessary." That line sat in my chest for hours because it captures the central tragedy perfectly. Monsters are rarely born in isolation inside this world. They're cultivated through fear, suppression, and survival. And wait until you notice how often mirrors appear around Eleanor throughout the series. Seriously, the visual storytelling here is sneaky. Reflections everywhere. Distorted water, polished armor, broken glass. The show keeps asking whether Eleanor still recognizes herself, or whether identity itself becomes unstable once power finally arrives too late. Not just too late chronologically, too late emotionally, too late to save innocence, too late to save a sister from trauma, too late to save a mother from becoming a ghost of herself. That's another reason the series works for me emotionally. It never pretends empowerment erases damage. Eleanor becomes powerful, yes, but power doesn't restore stolen years. It doesn't rewind humiliation. It just changes who controls the consequences now. And the cinematography absolutely understands this thematic shift. Early episodes frame Eleanor trapped constantly behind objects. Doorways, railings, curtains, crowded compositions. By the time she returns commanding dragons, the framing becomes wide and isolating instead. She finally occupies space, but now she's emotionally unreachable. Freedom arrives hand in hand with alienation. That is such a smart visual progression. There's also a really interesting undercurrent throughout the series about inheritance versus reinvention. Everybody around Eleanor is obsessed with preserving houses, bloodlines, traditions, social order. Eleanor increasingly becomes the embodiment of rupture. Not reform, rupture. And the dragons visually reinforce that because every time they appear, architecture suffers. Towers crack, flames consume banners, stone fractures under wing beats. The old world literally cannot remain structurally intact around her. And yet, this is where the show gets unexpectedly emotional. Eleanor still desperately wants acknowledgement from the people who failed her. That child wound never fully disappears. Even at her most terrifying, there are moments where a single look from her mother or a single sentence from her sister affects her more deeply than battlefield victories. The show never lets us forget the lonely girl underneath the myth forming around her. That's probably why the sister relationship became my favorite part of the entire drama, honestly. Not because it's wholesome, it absolutely is not for large stretches, but because it feels painfully alive. Their bond isn't built on speeches about sisterhood. It's built on shared survival inside a system designed to trade them away differently. One was sacrificed publicly, the other spiritually. And when they finally reconnect after Eleanor's transformation, the tension isn't just, "I missed you." It's this awful unspoken question hanging between them. Would either of them even recognize the other anymore if blood didn't force the connection? There's a dinner scene later on, and again, I'm staying moderate spoiler territory here, where the two of them sit across from each other after years of separation and political chaos, and the conversation itself is almost mundane. They talk about practical matters, alliances, stability, security, but the camera keeps lingering on tiny hesitations. A hand tightening around a cup, a delayed response, somebody almost saying something personal and then redirecting. You can feel decades of grief trying and failing to become language. That scene destroyed me more than some of the dragon attacks. Because this show understands something very human. Trauma changes conversational rhythm. People who have suffered together rarely say the exact thing they mean directly. They circle it, deflect it, test each other emotionally before risking vulnerability. The writing captures that beautifully. And honestly, I think the series gets underestimated because of the title and marketing. People hear the daughter who commands dragon and assume they're getting non-stop spectacle fantasy. But underneath all the fire and political betrayal, this is really a story about what prolonged powerlessness does to intimacy. Every relationship in the show has been contaminated by survival calculations. Love gets filtered through obligation, loyalty through fear. Even kindness often arrives carrying debt behind it. The romance subplot, which I know audiences are wildly divided on, actually works for me specifically because it's so emotionally inconvenient. I've seen some people complain that Eleanor never fully relaxes into romance. And my reaction was, good. Why would she? This woman grew up in an environment where affection was transactional and safety was conditional. Of course, vulnerability feels threatening to her. Of course, tenderness almost irritates her sometimes. There's a moment where someone reaches for her face gently during an argument, and she physically flinches before catching herself. Tiny acting choice. Barely emphasized. But it says everything about how disconnected she's become from uncomplicated touch. The series trusts viewers to notice those details instead of underlining them in neon marker. And wait, because the romantic dynamic becomes much more interesting once you realize the show isn't asking can Eleanor love? It's asking whether love itself can survive proximity to ambition this consuming. That's a way darker question. I also really appreciated that the love interest or potential love interest, depending on how people interpret certain late developments, isn't written as somebody who magically softens Eleanor into a morally safer protagonist. Thank God. I am so tired of fantasy stories where a dangerous woman gets emotionally house-trained by romance. Here, affection complicates her, sometimes destabilizes her, sometimes even sharpens her ruthlessness, because now there's another emotional vulnerability to protect. The chemistry works because it's rooted in tension instead of fantasy wish fulfillment. Conversations feel like negotiations half the time. People measuring risk while pretending they're discussing politics. One of my favorite exchanges in the entire show is basically two characters talking strategy while obviously talking about trust instead, and neither fully admits it aloud. That layered writing gives the performances room to breathe. Speaking of performances, Eleanor's actress does something really difficult across the season. She slowly alters the character's physical stillness. Early Eleanor moves cautiously, almost apologetically, even when angry. Later, Eleanor barely wastes movement at all. She stands differently, turns her head more slowly, maintains eye contact longer than is comfortable. By the final stretch, silence itself becomes one of her weapons. People start talking too much around her because they're desperate to fill the vacuum she creates. That evolution feels earned because the show tracks not just her rise in power, but her changing relationship to fear. At first, she fears consequences. Then she fears herself. Eventually, other people fear both. And man, the political side of the series gets vicious in a way I wasn't expecting. Not overly complicated in that every character has 17 secret cousins and 3 hidden alliances, style that some fantasy shows mistake for depth. It's actually fairly clean structurally, but emotionally, brutal, because every political maneuver ties back to personal history. That's why betrayals land so hard here. They're rarely abstract kingdom chess moves. They're emotional wounds reopening under new names. A council decision echoes a family rejection from years earlier. A military alliance resembles a forced marriage in miniature. The show constantly parallels public power with private violation. There's one sequence involving a negotiation chamber that genuinely had me sweating even though almost nobody raises their voice. Eleanor walks into this massive hall lined with dark banners and old stone pillars, and everybody there expects her to behave according to the old rules. Speak carefully, negotiate politely, accept incremental compromise. But she's already emotionally crossed a point they don't understand. The tension in that scene comes from realization spreading slowly across the room. One by one, people recognize they're no longer dealing with someone seeking acceptance from the system. They are dealing with someone deciding whether the system deserves to continue existing at all. That shift in perspective is terrifying. And I love that the show never fully reassures us about whether Eleanor is right. Sympathetic? Absolutely. Understandable? Completely. But always right? Not necessarily. The series refuses to simplify revolution into clean moral fantasy. Once institutions collapse, people suffer chaotically. Innocent lives get caught beneath falling structures too. The show keeps that discomfort alive. There's actually a surprisingly mature thematic thread running underneath the entire thing about cyclical violence. Eleanor hates the world that consumed her family through hierarchy and fear, yet she increasingly uses fear herself because it works. Dragons become political theater as much as military force. Public displays of dominance become strategic. And the frightening part is, she's effective. That's what makes the series compelling rather than merely empowering. It understands why oppressed people may eventually embrace terrifying methods. Not because they're inherently cruel, but because gentleness repeatedly failed to protect them. One of the most haunting visual motifs in the show is firelight on faces during moments of emotional rupture. The directors return to it constantly. Warmth visually associated with destruction. There's a late-night conversation Ilyana has beside a massive brazier where half her face keeps disappearing into shadow every time the flames shift, and it almost feels like the show externalizing her fractured identity in real time. Also, whoever handled the sound design deserves way more praise than they're probably getting. The dragons sound incredible, yes, but it's the quieter choices that stuck with me. Armor creaking during tense silences. Distant wind moving through empty halls. The subtle low-frequency rumble that sometimes appears underneath Ilyana's magic before anything visible even happens. The series uses sound almost psychologically. You start feeling tension before consciously recognizing why. And there's this one scene, oh my god, where Ilyana walks through the ruins of part of her ancestral home after returning. No music, just footsteps and drifting ash. She touches a damaged wall where markings from childhood still remain faintly visible underneath soot. The camera stays close enough that you can hear her breathing change. That hit me hard personally, because beneath all the fantasy mechanics, this is really a story about returning to places emotionally before you're ready. Seeing physical proof that time continued without your consent. I think a lot of people connect to that feeling even outside fantasy contexts. Coming back older, angrier, more capable. And realizing the past still has enough gravity to reduce you back into that younger self for a moment. I'll be honest too. Parts of this show made me uncomfortable in ways I genuinely appreciated. Ilyana's anger is not always presented as cleanly righteous. Sometimes it's possessive, sometimes paranoid, sometimes emotionally unfair. There are moments where she lashes out at people who care about her because vulnerability itself feels threatening. The script allows her to be difficult without framing that difficulty as proof she's secretly evil. That nuance matters, especially because female rage in fantasy television often gets flattened into extremes. Either women are saintly sufferers, or they become cartoon tyrants the second they embrace power. Ilyana exists in a much murkier emotional territory. She can be compassionate and frightening within the same conversation, sometimes within the same sentence. And I know this is going to sound weird, but one of my favorite things about the show is that it occasionally allows Ilyana to be petty. Not constantly, not sitcom petty, but recognizably human petty. There are moments where old humiliations visibly influence her reactions more than strategic logic should. Tiny hesitations before offering mercy. Slightly sharper remarks toward people who once dismissed her. You can tell she remembers every insult, every condescending glance. Honestly, that made her feel more real to me than if she'd transformed into some perfectly disciplined revolutionary icon. Because memory is emotional. Power doesn't erase that. The Archmid storyline becomes even more fascinating on rewatch too. At first, he feels almost archetypal, mysterious mentor hiding forbidden knowledge. But gradually the sadness underneath him becomes clearer. He's not just teaching Ilyana magic. He's watching history repeat itself in another form. There's regret all over that character. One scene especially stood out to me, where he observes Ilyana practicing alone from a distance and chooses not to interrupt despite recognizing how unstable the magic is becoming. The camera stays on him afterward longer than expected. Not proud, not horrified exactly either. Just tired. Like someone who understands that certain historical corrections arrive carrying catastrophic costs. The show gets a lot of mileage out of older characters realizing too late what they helped create through passivity. That's another reason the family dynamics hit so hard. Many of the people who failed Ileana aren't sadistic monsters twirling metaphorical mustaches. They're compromised survivors, cowards, people who normalize cruelty because confronting the system felt impossible or dangerous, which, honestly, makes the whole thing feel depressingly believable. And can we please talk about wardrobe design for a second? Because this production absolutely knew what it was doing visually. Ileana's clothing progression across the series is subtle but brilliant. Early on, she's constantly wrapped in restrictive layers and softer colors that visually blend her into noble environments. Later, the silhouettes become sharper, heavier, more angular, structured almost like armor even when she's not technically wearing armor. But the smart-ass detail? She never fully dresses like the established ruling class even after gaining immense power. Her aesthetic gradually becomes its own thing, less ornamental, more severe, almost ceremonial in a way disconnected from existing traditions. The clothes themselves start signaling ideological separation. There's one entrance scene where she walks into a gathering wearing dark lead fabric threaded with metallic detailing that catches candlelight like scales, and the room visibly reacts before she even speaks. Costume design functioning as narrative pressure. I love stuff like that. Wait until you notice how often the series frames Ileana physically above others too. Balconies, staircases, dragon-back shots, elevated platforms. At first it reads as basic dominance imagery, but eventually it starts feeling isolating instead. The higher she rises politically and magically, the fewer genuine equals remain around her. Visual superiority slowly transforms into emotional loneliness. That transition is heartbreaking, and I think that's where the show surprised me the most emotionally. Underneath all the vengeance and grandeur, there's this deep sadness running through the entire narrative. Ileana achieves extraordinary things, but the series keeps asking what parts of herself had to calcify in order to survive long enough to do it. There's a scene in the latter half where somebody from her past laughs unexpectedly at something small she says, and Ileana looks genuinely startled for half a second before recovering, like she momentarily forgot spontaneous warmth existed. That tiny reaction honestly crushed me more than some deaths, because trauma often reveals itself through unfamiliarity with ease. The inability to relax even when danger briefly subsides. The pacing the second half gets more aggressive too, but not in a sloppy way. The show smartly accelerates external events while slowing down emotionally important moments. Battles may move quickly, but conversations linger afterward. Consequences breathe. Characters sit with guilt instead of immediately sprinting toward the next plot point. That restraint separates the series from a lot of streaming fantasy lately where everything feels terrified of silence. There's also this incredible recurring tension between destiny and self-authorship. Other characters constantly try to mythologize Ileana. Prophecies, symbols, whispered titles, political narratives. But the show keeps questioning whether myth itself becomes another prison. If everybody sees you as an inevitable force of history, do you eventually lose the ability to imagine yourself as simply human? The dragon imagery reinforces that constantly. Once Ileana bonds with them publicly, ordinary interactions become harder. People project fear and legend onto her before conversations even begin. You can see moments where she almost misses anonymity despite everything it once cost her. And this is where I'm going to say something mildly contrarian. I actually think the slower middle stretch is essential to the show working emotionally. I've seen complaints that certain episodes spend too much time on political atmosphere, internal conflict, or relationship tension instead of moving the war narrative faster. But if you remove that material, the story loses psychological density. Ileana's transformation would become generic power fantasy instead of emotional corrosion mixed with liberation. The slowness lets the damage settle into people. that matters. Also, one of the sneakiest strengths of the writing is how often characters misunderstand each other for believable reasons rather than plot-manufactured stupidity. Conflicts emerge from differing emotional realities. Eleanor interprets caution as betrayal because she survived years of suppression. Others interpret her intensity as instability because they fear upheaval. Everybody's carrying different historical scars into conversations. That complexity makes even arguments feel layered. There are confrontation between Eleanor and a former ally where neither person is fully wrong, and the entire scene becomes painful precisely because both perspectives contain truth. He fears the destruction following her rise. She fears returning to a world where compliance equals erasure. Neither fear is irrational. The show trusts viewers enough to sit inside that discomfort instead of forcing an easy moral answer. And the music, man, the score gets under your skin gradually rather than immediately. It's not one of those endlessly bombastic fantasy soundtracks screaming for your attention every second. Themes emerge carefully. Certain vocal elements associated with Eleanor almost sound mournful rather than triumphant, which is such a smart choice because it keeps reminding you her victories carry grief inside them. There's a later dragon flight sequence at dusk where the music barely rises above a low haunting choral texture while Eleanor surveys territory below. And instead of feeling victorious, the moment feels elegiac. Like someone standing atop everything they once wanted only to realize the emotional cost arrived hidden inside the achievement. That emotional ambiguity is the soul of the series for me. Because the daughter who commands dragon never fully lets revenge become emotionally clean. Even when Eleanor succeeds, there's residue everywhere. Burned relationships, psychological damage, fear replacing affection in rooms that once held family. The series keeps asking whether reclaiming agency after prolonged oppression inevitably changes a person into someone unrecognizable. And maybe the cruelest part is that sometimes transformation is necessary anyway. There's this incredible stretch in the later episodes where the show almost starts behaving like a gothic tragedy instead of a traditional fantasy war drama, and I was completely locked in by that point. The castles feel emptier. Corridors echo more. Conversations happen in half-lit rooms where everybody looks sleep-deprived and spiritually cornered. Even victory scenes carry this exhausted atmosphere, like nobody involved fully believes peace is still an available outcome anymore. And Eleanor herself becomes harder to read in the best way. Not vague, not inconsistent, just layered enough that every expression feels debatable. There are moments where she looks at destruction she caused, and you can't tell whether she feels satisfaction, grief, numbness, or all three at once. The actress starts playing entire scenes through eye contact and breathing rhythm instead of dialogue. You really feel the emotional isolation tightening around her. One moment that completely floored me happens after a major public display of power. Everybody around Eleanor is reacting to her like a legend finally made flesh. Fear, awe, political panic, all of it. And then the scene cuts to her alone afterward, removing pieces of ceremonial armor in silence. No dramatic breakdown, no speech, just exhaustion. Bruises underneath the metal. Red marks where heavy clasps pressed into skin too long. That's such an important scene because it quietly strips the myth away again. The show keeps doing this fascinating push-pull where public perception turns Eleanor into something almost supernatural, while private moments remind you she's still a damaged person carrying impossible emotional weight. Those contrasts are where the series becomes genuinely great instead of merely entertaining. And honestly, I think a weaker version of this story would have made the dragons the emotional centerpiece. But the real centerpiece is inheritance. What gets passed down through families besides titles and blood? Fear, silence, obedience, shame. Eleanor inherits trauma long before she inherits power. There's even this subtle recurring idea that everybody in the series is haunted by somebody else's unfinished compromise. Parents sacrificing children for stability. Children inheriting resentment from parents too afraid to resist openly. Entire houses built on buried humiliations people pretend not to remember anymore. The dragons almost function like physical manifestations of buried truth. Once they enter spaces, denial stops being sustainable. And visually, the series becomes more ambitious as it goes on. There's an episode built around heavy snowfall that honestly looked gorgeous. Not in a glossy fantasy postcard way either. More bleak than beautiful. Snow accumulating on ruined stone. Torches struggling against wind. Armor frosted over during long silences between soldiers waiting for orders nobody wants to give. Eleanor walking through that frozen landscape in dark lead clothing while distant dragon calls echo through the mountains. Unbelievable atmosphere. The show really understands scale without constantly needing giant battles. Sometimes mood itself becomes scale. Wait, because one of the smartass things the writers do involves how different groups interpret Eleanor's rise completely differently. Oppressed people project hope onto her. Nobles project apocalypse. Former allies project unresolved guilt. Survivors project fear. And Eleanor herself increasingly seems unsure whether she's becoming a liberator or merely a more honest kind of tyrant. That uncertainty gives the whole series tension long after the initial revenge premise could have become repetitive. I also appreciate that the show doesn't romanticize rebellion logistically. Food shortages matter. Refugees matter. Political instability matters. There are scenes where ordinary people react to Eleanor's actions with complicated mixtures of gratitude and terror because large-scale societal upheaval always crushes vulnerable lives first, regardless of intention. That realism keeps the fantasy grounded emotionally. There's one exchange between two side characters, not even major players, discussing whether peace under cruelty was preferable to freedom under chaos, and the scene doesn't hand you an answer. It just lets the discomfort sit there. I love that. The series consistently trusts viewers enough to wrestle with morally unpleasant questions instead of flattening everything into easy empowerment rhetoric. And look, I know some audiences wanted more conventional heroism from Eleanor. I understand that instinct. She's charismatic. She suffered horribly. You naturally want catharsis for her. But I think the show's willingness to let her become frightening is exactly what elevates it above disposable fantasy content. Because history is full of people transformed by injustice into something both admirable and dangerous. The daughter who commands dragon actually has the courage to stare at that contradiction directly. There's a scene involving prisoners, I'll keep details vague, where Eleanor makes a decision that genuinely shocked me not because it was cartoonishly evil, but because of how emotionally detached she appears while doing it. Not sadistic. Wars. Practical. The series lets you realize that years of surviving dehumanization have slowly altered her relationship to mercy itself. And what makes the scene devastating is the reaction from somebody close to her afterward. Not outrage exactly. Mourning. Like watching someone they loved move one irreversible step farther away emotionally. That's the emotional texture this show keeps returning to. Distance. Between who Eleanor was and who she's becoming. Between what people need from her politically and what she can still offer personally. Between vengeance and healing. I swear, some of the quietest scenes hit the hardest. There are conversations late at night where Eleanor admits, indirectly, because she almost never speaks emotionally in a straight line anymore, that she no longer remembers what kind of future she originally wanted before survival consumed everything. That line wrecked me because suddenly the entire revenge arc reframes itself. She spent so long fighting against oppression that the concept of living beyond conflict became abstract. That's tragic. And weirdly relatable in a broader human sense too. Sometimes people organize their identities around surviving pain for so long that peace feels unfamiliar once it finally becomes possible. The show captures that psychological trap beautifully. I also need to give serious credit to the editing. because the rhythm of certain emotional reveals is incredibly precise. The series knows when to cut away before a scene becomes melodramatic. It knows when to hold uncomfortably long on silence. There's confidence in the pacing that a lot of streaming fantasy lacks right now. One transition especially stayed with me. A scene of political celebration cutting directly into Eleanor alone, listening to distant dragon sounds in darkness. Public triumph immediately undercut by private alienation. No dialogue needed. You understand everything emotionally in seconds. And can we talk about the dragons as emotional mirrors for a second? Because the show absolutely uses them that way. Their behavior shifts subtly alongside Eleanor's mental state. Early interactions are volatile, uncertain, almost testing boundaries. Later they become more synchronized with her emotional intensity. Not obedient exactly. Resonant. That distinction matters because the series never fully reduces the dragons into controllable weapons. They feel connected to Eleanor's inner fragmentation as much as her strength. Sometimes it even feels like commanding them costs pieces of her emotionally. There are sequences during a storm where Eleanor and one of the dragons move through clouds illuminated by lightning, and the visuals become almost abstract for moments. Sound muffles. The sky pulses white and black. You stop feeling like you're watching tactical warfare and start feeling like you're inside somebody's emotional breakdown externalized across the atmosphere itself. Absolutely incredible filmmaking there. And honestly, I think this show understands loneliness better than most fantasy dramas. Not romantic loneliness specifically, existential loneliness. The isolation of becoming emotionally incompatible with the world that created you. Eleanor can never really return home because home depended on her remaining smaller than she truly was. But becoming fully herself also alienates her from ordinary connection. That paradox sits at the center of the entire series. There's this tiny, heartbreaking moment where somebody from her childhood addresses her formally instead of using the familiar tone they once shared. And you can see the grief flicker across her face before she masks it. Power changes language. Distance changes language. The show notices details like that constantly. Wait until you notice how often Eleanor pauses before entering rooms in the later episodes too. Barely perceptible hesitation. As though she's preparing herself for performance every single time. Public identity hardening around private exhaustion. That's another reason the performance works so well. The actress never forgets the effort of being feared. A lot of stories portray intimidation as effortless coolness. Here it feels draining. Eleanor increasingly carries herself like someone aware every interaction could become political theater whether she wants it or not. And the side characters really help sell that atmosphere too. Especially the ones caught between loyalty and moral discomfort. Some support Eleanor while fearing what she's becoming. Others oppose her while privately acknowledging the old order deserved destruction. The emotional lines stay messy in ways I deeply appreciated. There's a military commander character who initially reads like a fairly standard skeptical ally. But over time you realize he represents something much more painful. The possibility that decent people often adapt too slowly to injustice until catastrophe becomes inevitable. His scenes with Eleanor are fascinating because they're both reacting to the same broken system from entirely different emotional timelines. He still believes institutions can be repaired. She doesn't. And every conversation between them feels shaped by that fundamental divide. The series also deserves praise for how it handles spectacle escalation. Too many fantasy shows burn through their most visually impressive material too early, then spend later episodes desperately trying to top themselves with bigger explosions. This drama stays emotionally strategic instead. Some of the larger-scale dragon moments happen relatively late because the show understands those scenes only matter if the emotional consequences underneath them have matured first. So when devastation finally erupts fully, it feels earned rather than decorative. There's one attack sequence in particular where the sound completely drops out for several seconds after impact. You just see debris drifting slowly through firelight, while distant figures move in shock. The choice to emphasize aftermath over action itself made the scene far more disturbing than if they'd gone for non-stop chaos editing. That restraint again. The series keeps choosing emotional impact over empty adrenaline. And I need to mention the use of eyes throughout the show because somebody behind the camera was absolutely obsessed with them in the best way. Reflections in dragon eyes. Eleanor watching herself in mirrors. Characters avoiding eye contact during betrayals. Extreme close-ups during moments where trust fractures silently. The whole series feels fixated on perception and recognition. Who truly sees Eleanor? Who only sees myth? Who still remembers the girl underneath all the power? Those questions keep resurfacing emotionally even when nobody states them outright. One thing I found especially compelling is that the series never treats femininity itself as weakness Eleanor must discard. That would have been the predictable route. Instead, the problem is patriarchal control over what femininity is allowed to mean. Eleanor's transformation isn't about becoming masculine-coded to access authority. It's about refusing containment altogether. That distinction matters so much. She can appear regal, emotionally perceptive, vulnerable, ruthless, nurturing, terrifying, sometimes all within the same episode. The show allows complexity instead of forcing empowerment through rejection of womanhood itself. There's a devastating interaction with her mother later on where years of mutual guilt finally surface indirectly. And again, the writing avoids easy reconciliation. Love exists there, deeply, but so does resentment. Eleanor cannot fully forgive the compromises that failed to protect them. Her mother cannot fully forgive herself either. The scene ends without emotional closure, just two people understanding each other more honestly than before. Honestly, that's braver writing than a big tearful forgiveness speech would have been. And I think that emotional honesty is why the show stayed with me after finishing it. Not because every plot twist shocked me or every battle sequence reinvented television. It stayed because the emotional dynamics felt painfully human beneath the fantasy framework. People hurting each other while trying to survive. People becoming unrecognizable to themselves. People inheriting damage they never chose. People confusing vengeance with healing because vengeance at least provides direction. That's the real engine underneath the daughter who commands dragon. Even the visual symbolism around fire evolves over time. Early on, fire often appears oppressive. Ceremonial torches, marriage rituals, controlled displays of power by the ruling structure. Later, dragonfire becomes destabilizing, liberating and horrifying simultaneously. The same elemental imagery transforms meaning alongside Eleanor herself. The show is constantly doing stuff like that quietly in the background. And man, there's one late confrontation that I still keep replaying in my head. No massive battle. No dragons overhead. Just Eleanor facing somebody tied deeply to her past, while years of unresolved history finally spill into the open. The lighting is dim, rain hitting stone outside, everybody exhausted beyond pride. And Eleanor says something like, "You wanted me small enough to survive your world." Not screamed, almost whispered. That line landed like a knife because it crystallized the entire tragedy. The people around her often believed compromise was protection. But protection built on erasure eventually becomes another form of violence. That's the emotional core of the whole drama right there. And the terrifying thing is, once Eleanor realizes that completely, there's no path backward anymore. By that point in the series, even the way other characters speak around Eleanor has changed. Conversations become careful, measured. People start editing themselves in real time. And the show is smart enough to let that social tension become visible instead of merely telling us she's feared now. You can literally watch rooms recalibrate around her presence. Advisors who once interrupted her suddenly wait for permission to continue speaking. Nobles avoid direct contradiction unless absolutely necessary. Servants lower their eyes faster. Tiny behavioral shifts. But together they create this suffocating atmosphere where Ilyana finally has the authority she was denied her entire life. And it isolates her even further. That's the cruel irony the series keeps circling. She spent years wanting acknowledgement, wanting space, wanting her power recognized as real. Then she finally gets it, and the recognition arrives tangled up with terror. People don't just respect her, they brace for her. There's a scene where a child stares at Ilyana with awe after witnessing one of the dragons overhead. And for one brief second, you see genuine softness return to her face. Almost wonder. Then the child's parent immediately pulls them back protectively, and the expression disappears again. Such a small moment, barely 30 seconds, but emotionally devastating because it captures the entire contradiction of her existence now. She's become a symbol powerful enough to inspire people and frighten them simultaneously. And honestly, that emotional duality is what separates this drama from so many fantasy stories trying to manufacture strong female protagonists through surface-level aesthetics alone. Ilyana isn't compelling because she gives cold one-liners while standing in armor looking photogenic beside CGI fire. She's compelling because the show allows power to deform her emotionally in believable ways while still preserving her humanity underneath it. That balance is incredibly difficult to pull off. Too much cruelty and audiences detach emotionally. Too much softness and the character loses thematic weight. The daughter who commands dragon somehow threads that needle almost the entire way through. Even when Ilyana crosses lines morally, the show never loses sight of the emotional logic that brought her there. Not justification. Logic. There's a difference. You understand the architecture of a rage even when you fear where it's taking her. And I have to say, one of the boldest choices the series makes is refusing to turn every conflict into physical confrontation. Some of the most intense scenes are people talking quietly in rooms where history itself feels present. The emotional stakes carry enough voltage that a conversation across a table can feel more dangerous than open warfare. There's this incredible exchange involving inheritance rights and political legitimacy where, on paper, the dialogue is technically about governance. But underneath it, everybody in the room is really arguing about whether Ilyana was ever considered fully human within this society to begin with. The subtext becomes suffocating. That's another thing the writing handles beautifully. People almost never articulate the deepest emotional truth directly. They speak through systems, through politics, through ritual language, through duty. And you're left reading the pain leaking underneath formal structures. It feels very true to how families with generational trauma actually communicate. The show also becomes increasingly interested in memory as a burden. Not memory as nostalgia. Memory as poison. Ilyana cannot forget what happened to her sister. Cannot forget her mother's compromises. Cannot forget every room where she was diminished. And because she remembers so intensely, forgiveness becomes almost impossible. There's a chilling moment where somebody suggests moving forward without revisiting the past. And Ilyana looks genuinely confused by the idea, as though forgetting itself sounds morally obscene to her. The performance there is incredible because it's not anger first. It's disbelief. Like, how could you possibly ask me to carry this pain quietly so everyone else can feel comfortable again? That emotional reality gives the entire revenge structure deeper weight than usual fantasy catharsis. And the series understands something uncomfortable about suffering too. Prolonged humiliation changes your relationship to control. Ilyana increasingly micromanages situations emotionally because chaos once nearly destroyed her life. She wants certainty now, predictability, control over outcomes before vulnerability can emerge again. Which means even moments of affection become tense. There's a beautifully awkward scene where someone tries to comfort her after a loss, and Ilyana almost doesn't know how to receive uncomplicated care anymore. She keeps redirecting the conversation toward logistics and strategy because emotional openness feels less manageable than warfare. That hit me hard because the show never frames trauma responses as poetic. They're isolating, frustrating, sometimes unfair to the people trying to love you. And wait, because this becomes especially painful once the series starts exploring what Eleanor actually wants beyond revenge. The answer is unclear, maybe even to her. She understands destruction more easily than restoration by the later episodes. That's tragic in a very human way. There's one sequence involving reconstruction efforts in a damaged region that I thought was quietly brilliant. Everyone expects Eleanor to feel triumphant overseeing change after so much struggle. But instead she seems emotionally distant from the process. Comfortable in crisis. Uncomfortable in healing. The show doesn't explain that with exposition either. It just lets the behavior speak for itself. I really appreciated how often the drama trusted visual storytelling over endless dialogue. A lot of fantasy series right now are terrified viewers might miss thematic material unless somebody literally announces it in speech form. This show lets imagery carry emotional information. For example, notice how often Eleanor is framed beside damaged architecture after gaining power. Cracked walls, burned halls, half-collapsed towers. It's not subtle exactly, but it's emotionally effective because the environments start reflecting her internal condition. She becomes associated with transformation through destruction. Even Dragonfire itself evolves symbolically across the story. Early on it feels mythic, distant. Later it becomes intimate, political, personal. By the end, every burst of flame carries emotional context tied directly to Eleanor's state of mind. And the dragons never stop feeling ancient, which I loved. The series resists making them overly expressive in a humanized way. They remain slightly unreadable. Their connection with Eleanor feels spiritual and instinctive rather than domesticated. Sometimes it's almost like they recognize something broken inside her that mirrors their own existence outside human systems. One of my favorite visual moments in the whole series happens during dawn after a catastrophic night sequence. Smoke still hanging in the air, ash drifting slowly through pale light. Eleanor standing motionless while one dragon settles behind her in near silence. No triumphant music, no applause, just devastation and stillness. The image feels less like conquest and more like irreversible transformation. That's the tone the series nails better than almost anything else. The sense that history is happening whether people emotionally survive it or not. And I know I've talked a lot about Eleanor, but the supporting cast genuinely matters here because they function almost like different moral responses to oppression. Some choose compromise, some choose endurance, some choose loyalty to systems because uncertainty frightens them more than injustice. Others radicalize alongside Eleanor for entirely different reasons. Nobody feels like they exist solely to orbit the protagonist. Even relatively small characters get moments revealing how societal structures shape them psychologically. A guard who hesitates before following orders. A noblewoman quietly adapting to changing power dynamics faster than the men around her. A servant recognizing danger before anyone else because powerless people always learn to read rooms carefully. Those details build a believable world. And man, the series really understands ceremonial cruelty. Weddings, councils, public rituals, formal gatherings. So many scenes involve people performing civility, while violence operates underneath every interaction. The pageantry becomes oppressive over time. Gold embroidery starts feeling sinister. Thrones feel suffocating rather than glamorous. There's a feast sequence that honestly felt closer to horror than fantasy by the end of it. Nothing supernatural even happens. It's all eye contact and implication and political humiliation unfolding beneath polite conversation. But the tension is unbearable because you know every smile in the room is concealing calculation. That atmosphere made the eventual eruptions of Dragonfire feel emotionally earned rather than random spectacle. Because the series spends so much time showing controlled cruelty, uncontrolled destruction almost starts feeling inevitable. Still, What impressed me most is that the show never fully abandons tenderness. It becomes rarer, quieter, harder to access, but it survives in fragments, shared memories, protective gestures, someone remembering how Ileana used to laugh before everything changed. Those moments matter because they remind you there's still a person underneath the legend. There's a tiny scene where Ileana absent-mindedly repeats a phrase her sister used years earlier and briefly smiles before realizing what she's done. The smile vanishes almost immediately, but the emotional impact lingers because you suddenly remember how young she really still is beneath all the myth-making. That's the tragedy. Ileana becomes historically significant before she fully gets the chance to become emotionally whole. And the show understands how exhausting significance can be. By the final stretch, every choice Ileana makes carries symbolic weight whether she intends it or not. People interpret her constantly. Allies search her face for reassurance. Enemies search it for weakness. Entire regions react to rumors about her movements. You start to feel the crushing pressure of existing as both person and political force simultaneously. There's a moment where someone asks her directly what she wants the future to look like, and she hesitates too long before answering. That hesitation tells you everything. She understands vengeance intimately, survival intimately. But imagining peace? That's harder. Honestly, that may be the most heartbreaking thing in the entire series. Because somewhere underneath the dragons and war and revenge is still the girl who simply wanted to be allowed access to her own gift without being punished for existing wrong in the eyes of her society. And once you really absorb that, every later act of destruction becomes sadder. Not weaker emotionally, sadder. The show also deserves enormous credit for refusing to flatten the mother character into either villain or martyr. That relationship remains painfully unresolved in realistic ways. Ileana's mother failed her, yes, but often from terror rather than malice. She survived by adapting to systems Ileana eventually chose to burn down. Both women understand each other too late. That dynamic hit me personally because families often pass down survival strategies that become harmful in different historical conditions. What protected one generation emotionally cripples the next. The series captures that tension beautifully without reducing anybody into simple moral categories. And there's one late scene, I won't spoil specifics, where Ileana and her mother sit together in near silence while distant dragon sounds echo outside. No dramatic reconciliation, no complete forgiveness, just shared exhaustion and recognition. Honestly, I almost cried. Not because the scene manipulates emotion aggressively, but because it understands that sometimes love survives even when relationships never fully heal. That emotional maturity runs through the entire drama. Even the final political conflicts avoid easy fantasy simplification. There's no neat division between pure evil and pure righteousness. The old order was cruel and unsustainable, yes, but upheaval creates suffering too. Ileana becomes both liberator and destabilizing force depending on who's experiencing the consequences. The series refuses to solve that contradiction cleanly. And thank God for that, honestly. I'm tired of fantasy stories pretending revolution is emotionally tidy. There's blood in structural change. There's grief. There are unintended victims. There are people who deserved better than the systems surrounding them but still become casualties of collapse anyway. The daughter who commands Dragon understands that deeply. And maybe that's why the show lingered with me so long afterward. Not because it gave me comforting answers, but because it respected the emotional complexity of transformation. Personal transformation, familial transformation, societal transformation. None of it happens without loss. By the end, Ileana isn't merely reclaiming power. She's forcing the world to confront everything it demanded women bury quietly for generations. Rage, ambition, intellect, grief, hunger for recognition, refusal to remain ornamental. The dragons are just the loudest expression of that refusal. And when I think back on the series now, weirdly, The images that stay with me most aren't even the biggest spectacle moments. It's Eleanor pausing outside doors before entering rooms. Her sister watching her with love and fear mixed together. The mother smoothing fabric with shaking hands. Firelight reflecting in tired eyes. Silence stretching too long during family conversations when nobody knows how to bridge years of damage anymore. That's the soul of the show. The fantasy gives it scale, but the emotional truth gives it weight. And honestly, for all its dragons and prophecies and political warfare, The Daughter Who Commands Dragon is ultimately about what happens when somebody denied personhood long enough finally stops asking whether the world is comfortable with their power. By then, the answer barely matters anymore. And that's where the series becomes almost frighteningly honest about power. Because once Eleanor stops seeking approval from the structures that rejected her, everybody around her has to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the system only ever functioned because people like her kept consenting to their own diminishment? What happens when that consent disappears completely? The show keeps returning to that question in different forms. You see it in the nobles suddenly scrambling to reinterpret old traditions once they realize those traditions no longer protect them. You see it in allies who supported Eleanor abstractly until her actual methods begin threatening their comfort too. You even see it in ordinary citizens trying to decide whether they're witnessing liberation or the birth of another cycle they'll eventually suffer beneath. And the genius of the writing is that all of those reactions feel understandable. Nobody wakes up thinking they're preserving injustice. Most people in this world are trying to survive structures older than themselves. That's what makes the drama emotionally rich instead of cartoonishly binary. The ruling order isn't upheld solely by obvious villains. It's upheld by exhausted compliance, fear of instability, generational conditioning, the belief that partial suffering is safer than unpredictable change. Eleanor becomes dangerous because she stops believing those compromises are survivable. There's a brutal emotional clarity to that. One scene I keep thinking about involves a council argument where multiple characters insist Eleanor's actions are too extreme, and for a second you almost agree with them because the destruction surrounding her really is escalating. Then the camera cuts to Eleanor listening in silence, and you suddenly remember. These same people considered her sister disposable, considered her mother expendable, considered her own gifts intolerable unless controlled. The show never lets institutional hypocrisy hide behind civility. That's why even quieter confrontations carry so much weight. Every political disagreement contains years of buried emotional history underneath it. Every negotiation feels haunted. And honestly, some of the best acting in the series happens when characters realize they can no longer emotionally reach Eleanor the way they once could. You watch people trying old conversational dynamics that simply don't work anymore. Appeals to obedience, appeals to family duty, appeals to patience. None of them land because the person those methods once controlled has fundamentally changed. There's this heartbreaking interaction where someone from Eleanor's past tries speaking to her in the same gently dismissive tone they used when she was younger, almost out of habit, and the entire atmosphere freezes. Not because Eleanor explodes. She doesn't. She just looks at them differently now, with awareness instead of longing. And suddenly the old hierarchy dies in real time. That scene says more about emotional liberation than any giant speech could. The series is filled with moments like that where psychological shifts become more important than external action. A person finally realizing they're no longer afraid. A family member recognizing too late that affection without respect was never enough. Someone understanding that the version of Eleanor they preferred only existed because she lacked the power to resist openly. Those realizations hurt, especially because the show refuses to frame emotional awakening as purely triumphant. Eleanor gains clarity, but clarity isolates her. Once she sees the mechanisms of her oppression clearly, she cannot comfortably participate in them anymore. That awareness creates distance everywhere she goes. Even moments of temporary peace feel tense because she's become too conscious of underlying structures to fully relax inside them. There's a beautiful scene involving music during a formal gathering where everyone else appears swept up in celebration, while Ileana stands slightly apart, observing the room almost analytically. Not cold exactly, hyper-aware. The camera drifts slowly around her while laughter echoes in the background. And for a second, she looks profoundly lonely despite technically standing in a crowded hall. That image stayed with me because it captures something emotionally real about surviving systemic humiliation. Once you understand how conditional your acceptance was, ordinary social spaces never feel innocent again. The daughter who commands dragon understands that psychology with uncomfortable precision. And I really need to praise the show's restraint regarding exposition. Lesser fantasy dramas would constantly stop to explain lore, prophecy mechanics, dragon politics, magical systems. This series gives you enough structure to follow the stakes, but it never drowns the emotional core beneath encyclopedia writing. Magic matters here because of what it represents emotionally. Forbidden knowledge, buried potential, historical suppression, generational fear. The actual mechanics stay secondary to the emotional consequences, which is exactly the right choice for this story. Even the dragon bond itself remains slightly mysterious throughout, and I loved that. The show understands that over-explaining mystical connection often weakens it. Instead, the relationship feels instinctive and emotionally symbolic. Sometimes protective, sometimes volatile, sometimes almost parasitic in the way Ileana's emotional state appears to influence the creatures around her. There's one especially unsettling sequence where a dragon reacts aggressively during a moment of Ileana's emotional instability, and nobody in the scene fully knows whether the creature is mirroring her feelings or amplifying them. That ambiguity makes the magic feel dangerous in a psychologically interesting way. And visually, the series becomes increasingly haunted-looking as it progresses. Early episodes still contain traces of courtly beauty and traditional fantasy elegance. Later episodes feel harsher, darker fabrics, more shadow-heavy interiors, burned landscapes, smoke-stained stone. The world itself starts reflecting accumulated emotional damage. It's not just aesthetic escalation either. It feels thematic. Civilization deteriorating under the pressure of truths it refused to confront earlier. There's a point where even daylight scenes stop feeling safe. I also appreciate how the show handles fear politically. Fear isn't treated as morally simple. Sometimes fear protects vulnerable people from danger. Sometimes it preserves injustice. Sometimes it radicalizes people into violence. Different characters weaponize fear differently throughout the story. Ileana eventually learns how effective fear can be, which becomes one of the most morally unsettling aspects of her arc, because she understands exactly what fear did to her life. So when she begins intentionally creating fear in others, the emotional implications become deeply complicated. There's a scene where she makes an example of someone publicly, and afterward, you can see the reaction ripple outward through everyone watching. Some appear relieved, some horrified, some newly loyal, some quietly terrified. The series doesn't simplify the political effectiveness of intimidation even while showing its corrosive impact emotionally. That complexity is why discussions around this show are going to be fascinating for years if it maintains this level of quality. People are going to argue endlessly about where Ileana crossed the line, whether she crossed it at all, whether the line itself was defined by oppressive structures in the first place. The drama invites those debates intentionally, and I love that it trusts audiences enough to engage with moral ambiguity instead of spoon-feeding conclusions. There's also this recurring emotional thread involving names and titles that becomes increasingly important. Early on, Ileana is constantly defined relationally: someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's political inconvenience. As her influence grows, titles begin accumulating around her instead. Mythic labels, fearful whispers, symbols replacing personhood again, just in a different direction. That evolution is tragic because even empowerment doesn't fully restore individuality. It just changes the narrative framing around her existence. One late interaction really crystallized this for me. Somebody uses Eleanor's old familiar name during a tense conversation, and the moment lands almost shockingly intimate because so few people still address her as a person rather than an institution by that stage. You realize how lonely symbolic power can become. And the show is incredibly good at portraying emotional exhaustion physically. Characters look tired in later episodes. Not glamorous, battle-worn, tired either. Spiritually depleted. Eyes heavy. Posture rigid from stress. Conversations slowing under the weight of accumulated grief. The world feels lived through by the end. There's one shot of Eleanor sitting alone after massive political victory, still wearing partial ceremonial clothing while dawnlight creeps into the room, and she looks less like a conqueror than someone who hasn't slept properly in years. That image honestly summarizes the entire emotional thesis of the series for me. Power achieved through survival carries exhaustion inside it. And man, the sibling dynamic just keeps getting richer the more the story progresses. Because the sister doesn't merely represent Eleanor's lost innocence or motivation for revenge. She represents an alternate survival strategy. Endurance instead of rupture. Adaptation instead of open defiance. Their relationship becomes almost ideological eventually. But underneath the politics and pain, love remains stubbornly present between them in ways neither fully knows how to express anymore. Sometimes they protect each other badly. Sometimes they misunderstand each other completely. Sometimes they weaponize honesty during arguments because only family knows exactly where to hurt you. It feels painfully authentic. There's an argument where years of resentment finally crack open, and neither woman says the correct thing emotionally. They interrupt each other. Misread intentions. Drag old wounds into present conflicts. But that messiness is exactly why the scene works so well. Family trauma rarely resolves into perfectly articulated emotional breakthroughs. Sometimes people love each other fiercely and still cannot stop hurting one another. The series understands that with brutal precision. And honestly, one of the saddest aspects of the whole story is realizing how young Eleanor was when her emotional development essentially became consumed by survival. There are flashes throughout the show, tiny moments of humor, curiosity, awkwardness, where you glimpse who she might have become in a kinder world. Those moments almost hurt more than the tragedies, because the show keeps reminding you that beneath the terrifying political figure and dragon commander is somebody who originally just wanted dignity, recognition, the freedom to exist without shrinking herself constantly. Everything afterwards spirals out from that denied humanity. And I think that's why the fantasy elements work so well emotionally. The dragons externalize emotional realities already present in the narrative. Rage large enough to alter landscapes. Suppressed potential becoming impossible to contain. Ancient forces awakening because existing systems grew too brittle and cruel to survive unchanged. The spectacle means something psychologically. Even the flight scenes carry emotional subtext. Early flights feel unstable and frightening. Later ones feel isolating. Eleanor soaring above territories she influences, yet no longer fully belongs to emotionally. The freedom is real, but so is the distance. One dusk sequence especially wrecked me. Eleanor flying silently over lands recovering from conflict, while smoke trails rise faintly below and the soundtrack barely whispers underneath the wind. The scene should feel victorious structurally. Instead it feels mournful, reflective, like someone realizing no version of victory could restore what history already consumed. That emotional honesty is what elevates the show beyond standard revenge fantasy. Because revenge stories often promise emotional completion through reversal of power dynamics. This series understands that reversal changes circumstances, not memory. Trauma doesn't disappear once the oppressed gain leverage. Sometimes it deepens into something more complicated. Eleanor never fully stops being the person who remembers what helplessness felt like. That memory shapes every decision she makes afterward. And that memory is exactly why some of the most unsettling moments in the series aren't the obvious acts of destruction. It's the moments where Eleanor anticipates humiliation before it even arrives. The reflex never fully leaves her, even after commanding dragons, even after terrifying kingdoms. You still catch traces of the girl who learned to scan rooms for danger before speaking. There's a scene where a council member pauses slightly too long before responding to her, and you can see Eleanor's entire body tense for a fraction of a second as if expecting dismissal. The pause probably means nothing malicious objectively, but trauma teaches people to prepare for contempt constantly. The actress communicates all of that in maybe 2 seconds of screen time. That kind of emotional continuity is rare. A lot of stories treat transformation like deleting an old personality file and installing a stronger one. This drama understands that old wounds remain active underneath reinvention. Power layers over pain. It doesn't erase it. And honestly, that's why Eleanor's anger keeps feeling emotionally alive instead of performative. It isn't abstract rage about destiny or prophecy. It's cumulative, personal, built from years of small violations as much as major tragedies. The show pays attention to emotional sediment. Every dismissal mattered. Every compromise mattered. Every time she was told indirectly that her existence required limitation for other people's comfort. By the time she stops accepting those limitations, the backlash feels inevitable. There's this incredible sequence where several political figures attempt to appeal to Eleanor's better nature, and the scene becomes almost darkly ironic because their definition of a better nature basically means compliance, restraint, patience, continued willingness to absorb injustice quietly so social stability remains intact. And the show doesn't need Eleanor to deliver some giant empowering speech in response. Her silence says enough. She finally recognizes the emotional trap underneath the language. That realization changes her permanently. I think that's also why the series resonates beyond fantasy audiences. Beneath the dragons and castles, it's deeply about what happens when marginalized people stop confusing politeness with morality. The old order in this world survives partly because the burden of emotional discipline always falls on the oppressed. Eleanor eventually rejects that burden completely. The consequences are catastrophic, but emotionally understandable. That tension is the entire engine of the show. And man, the visual storytelling around isolation just keeps getting stronger the further the narrative progresses. There are so many shots of Eleanor framed alone in massive spaces after gaining power. Throne rooms too large for intimacy. Balconies overlooking territories that now fear her. Long corridors where footsteps echo endlessly. Even surrounded by allies, she increasingly looks solitary. Not because nobody cares about her, because power itself has altered the conditions of connection around her. There's one heartbreaking scene where somebody laughs naturally around Eleanor before suddenly remembering who she has become politically, and you literally watch the atmosphere change mid-conversation. The laughter cuts off too quickly. Formality returns. Eleanor notices. Of course she notices. The grief on her face in that moment is tiny but devastating. Because the series understands how frightening it is when people stop interacting with you honestly. Fear contaminates intimacy, and the dragons contribute to that emotional distance in subtle ways too. They become symbols other characters cannot emotionally separate from Eleanor anymore. Even when she's vulnerable, exhausted, or uncertain, people increasingly project myth onto her first. One of the smartest choices the show makes is refusing to let Eleanor fully enjoy her own legend. She understands its utility politically, but emotionally the mythology often seems to trap her. Once society turns somebody into a symbol, ordinary humanity becomes difficult to access. There's a late-night scene where she's alone with one of the dragons, and For maybe the only time in several episodes, she appears emotionally unguarded. No political performance, no intimidation, just fatigue and silence. The dragon lowers itself beside her almost protectively, and the moment feels strangely tender without becoming sentimental. That relationship works because it bypasses human systems entirely. The dragons don't care about noble expectations, gender rules, ceremonial obedience. They respond to something more instinctive inside her. And maybe that's why Ileana seems calmer around them than around most people by the end. Which is honestly kind of tragic when you think about it. The show keeps suggesting that power liberated Ileana from oppression while simultaneously making ordinary belonging nearly impossible. There's also this fascinating recurring motif involving thresholds and entrances. Ileana constantly pauses before entering rooms, halls, war councils, family chambers. At first, I thought it was just dramatic staging, but eventually it starts feeling psychological. Every doorway represents transformation. Every entrance requires recalibrating identity. Who does she need to be in this room? Daughter? Conqueror? Symbol? Survivor? Monster? The answer changes constantly, and you can feel the exhaustion of maintaining those shifting selves. And I have to say, the political writing becomes especially sharp whenever the show explores how quickly institutions rewrite moral language once power shifts. Behaviors once dismissed in Ileana become rebranded as strength once she becomes politically unavoidable. The same nobles who condemned ambition suddenly praise decisiveness. The same structures that denied her legitimacy start adapting rhetorically to survive her rise. That hypocrisy infuriates Ileana precisely because she remembers everything. Memory is her greatest weapon and greatest curse. There are conversations where somebody insists the world is changing now, and Ileana responds with this look that basically says, "Only because you're finally afraid." No speech necessary, just contempt sharpened by years of observation. And the contempt in this series is written so well because it rarely erupts theatrically. It simmers. People weaponize politeness constantly. Old resentments leak through carefully controlled dialogue. Characters smile while emotionally cutting each other open. Some of the family scenes honestly feel more dangerous than the battlefield sequences, especially once the story reaches the point where reconciliation becomes emotionally uncertain. Not impossible exactly, but fragile, complicated by too much accumulated damage. There are moments between Ileana and her sister where they briefly fall back into old conversational rhythms from childhood, and it's honestly one of the warmest scenes in the series. For maybe 30 seconds, the political tension disappears. They sound like sisters again instead of historical survivors carrying incompatible scars. Then reality returns almost immediately. And that abrupt shift hurts more because the warmth felt genuine. The series is full of these fleeting glimpses into emotional lives that might have existed under different circumstances. Alternative futures haunting the edges of scenes. I think that's why the drama feels so emotionally heavy by the later episodes. It isn't just mourning what happened. It's mourning possibilities destroyed before they fully formed. Ileana herself increasingly feels haunted by unlived versions of herself. There's a scene involving children practicing basic magic training under supervision, and Ileana watches them with this unreadable expression that slowly resolves into grief once you realize what she's seeing. A world where ability is nurtured instead of punished. A version of life she never received. That scene nearly broke me, because the show doesn't overplay it emotionally. Nobody comments on her reaction. The moment simply exists and passes. But internally, you understand exactly why it devastates her. And honestly, I think the series deserves enormous credit for how it handles female anger without flattening it into empowerment merchandise. Ileana's rage isn't framed as cute rebellion or marketable aesthetic. It's painful, destructive, sometimes justified, sometimes excessive, often both simultaneously. The show allows her fury to retain moral and emotional complexity. That's rare, especially in fantasy television, where women are often forced into impossible binaries. Pure nurturing victim or seductive chaos monster. Eleanor exists between those extremes in a way that feels startlingly human. She can protect people genuinely while terrifying them. She can love someone and still emotionally wound them. She can pursue justice while becoming increasingly comfortable with domination. Those contradictions are the character, and the series never fully resolves them because real people aren't emotionally coherent all the time either. There's this one exchange with a former ally that perfectly captures the tragedy of Eleanor's arc. He accuses her of becoming unrecognizable, and instead of denying it, she asks whether the version he preferred was simply easier to control. That line lands like an explosion because it forces both the character and the audience to confront an ugly possibility. Maybe society often confuses compliance with goodness. The show keeps pressing on that wound relentlessly, and visually, the later episodes almost start resembling myth already in progress. Smoke-filled skies, blackened stone, dragon silhouettes against storms. But beneath all that grandeur, the emotional center remains painfully intimate. Family damage, emotional estrangement, the exhaustion of surviving transformation. One of my favorite directing choices involves how rarely the series gives Eleanor uncomplicated triumph shots. Even her most visually dominant moments usually contain some counterweight emotionally. Isolation, mourning, fear in surrounding faces, physical exhaustion. The imagery refuses easy catharsis. There's a sequence where she stands before a crowd after a massive victory, dragons overhead, banners burning in the distance. And structurally the scene looks like pure conquest fantasy. But the camera keeps cutting to reactions instead of simply glorifying her. People crying, people terrified, people hopeful, people grieving. The scene becomes about historical rupture rather than personal glory. That complexity is what makes the show linger. And wait until you notice how often Eleanor touches objects connected to memory throughout the series. Damaged walls, old jewelry, childhood markings, pieces of fabric. She's constantly grounding herself physically in remnants of the past, even while trying to reshape the future. It's like she's terrified of forgetting who all this destruction originally began for. Because that's another subtle fear running underneath the narrative. What if power eventually consumes the original pain driving it? What if vengeance becomes self-sustaining beyond justice? The show never answers that cleanly. Instead, it lets the question haunt Eleanor increasingly. There's a terrifying scene where someone asks her whether she still knows where the line is anymore, and silence afterward feels endless. Not because she's secretly evil, because she genuinely may not know how to define the line outside survival now. That uncertainty gives the final stretch enormous emotional tension. And I really appreciate that the series doesn't pretend trauma automatically grants moral clarity. Eleanor understands oppression intimately, yes, but suffering alone doesn't guarantee wisdom. Sometimes it creates blind spots too. Paranoia, control issues, emotional defensiveness. The show allows those complications without undermining sympathy for her. That balance is incredibly mature writing. It also helps that the supporting cast remains emotionally active rather than existing solely to react to Eleanor. Her sister develops harder edges over time too. Her mother becomes more emotionally honest in painful ways. Allies grow conflicted. Enemies occasionally reveal uncomfortable truths. Everyone evolves under pressure. The world changes people collectively, not just the protagonist. And man, there's a devastating recurring idea throughout the show that some relationships cannot survive historical transformation intact, no matter how much love existed originally. People become symbols to each other, representations of choices, survivors of incompatible realities. Eleanor increasingly embodies change itself, and not everyone can emotionally survive proximity to that. Even affection becomes politically charged around her eventually. One conversation near the later episodes absolutely wrecked me because it revolves around whether Ilyana still remembers simpler things from before everything collapsed. The question sounds small, innocent almost, but underneath it is terror. Someone desperately trying to locate the person they used to know inside the myth history is constructing around her. And for a moment, just a moment, you see that younger Ilyana surface again. Then the scene ends. That's the emotional cruelty of the series. It keeps letting you glimpse who these people could have been before the world demanded impossible things from them. And I think that's ultimately why the ending lands with such strange emotional force. Not because it ties everything into a neat moral lesson, it absolutely does not. But because it understands that transformation on this scale leaves emotional wreckage no matter who wins. By the final episodes, nobody in this world is untouched anymore. Not Ilyana, not her family, not the people who opposed her, not the people who followed her. History has moved through all of them like fire through dry timber. And the show never romanticized that cost. There's this incredible atmosphere hanging over the last stretch where everybody seems aware they're living inside the aftermath of irreversible choices. Conversations slow down. Characters look at each other longer before speaking. Even the dragons feel heavier somehow, less mythic and more anciently tired. The entire series develops this exhausted emotional gravity that I honestly found mesmerizing. One late scene in particular completely stayed with me. Ilyana walks through part of the restored stronghold that once symbolized everything denied to her. Servants stop and bow. Guards move aside instantly. Nobody questions her authority anymore. And she looks miserable. Not dramatically miserable. Not collapsing into tears. Just profoundly aware that recognition arrived too late to heal the person who originally needed it. That's the tragedy. The world finally makes space for Ilyana only after she becomes powerful enough to terrify it. And once you understand that emotionally, the entire series reframes itself. This was never a story about somebody discovering strength. It was about somebody discovering what they would have to become in order for strength to be acknowledged at all. That difference matters a lot. Because the daughter who commands dragon isn't really interested in empowerment fantasy in the simple sense. It's interested in the emotional violence hidden inside systems that force people to earn basic dignity through extraordinary suffering first. That's why the quieter scenes hit so hard even near the end. The spectacle becomes almost secondary emotionally. The dragons are incredible. Yes, the political collapse is compelling. The confrontations are sharp and emotionally loaded. But what lingers are the moments where characters realize what cannot be repaired. There's a devastating exchange between Ilyana and someone who once loved her in a simpler way, and neither person is technically wrong. One mourns who she has become. The other mourns that nobody cared enough to prevent her from becoming this in the first place. That's the entire emotional thesis of the show condensed into one interaction. And honestly, I love that the series never fully answers whether Ilyana achieves peace internally. It would have felt dishonest if it suddenly pretended years of systemic humiliation, family trauma, violence, and isolation could resolve into clean emotional closure. The ending gives you understanding more than comfort. There's still grief inside her by the final frame. Still loneliness. Still rage, probably. But also something else. Awareness maybe. Ownership. The sense that for better or worse, she finally belongs to herself instead of the expectations that once suffocated her. And the final scenes are directed with such confidence too. The show doesn't oversell emotion. It trusts stillness, silence, space. One of the last dragon sequences isn't framed like conquest at all. It feels reflective, almost elegiac. Ilyana moving through open sky while the world below bears visible scars from everything that happened. The image feels less like victory than consequence. I love that choice because this series consistently refuses fantasy shortcuts. It refuses the easy route where pain automatically produces purity. It refuses the idea that reclaiming power magically restores innocence. It refuses to flatten complicated women into either saints or monsters just because audiences are more comfortable with extremes. Eleanor remains emotionally unresolved in ways that feel painfully human. And I think that's why people are going to keep arguing about her long after finishing the show. Some viewers are going to see her as justified almost completely. Others will view her as a warning about how trauma and power interact. Most people, I think, will land somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, admiring her, fearing her, mourning for her, maybe recognizing pieces of themselves in her anger more than they expected to. That ambiguity is the show's greatest strength. There's a moment near the conclusion where somebody refers to Eleanor almost like a historical figure already, and the reaction on her face is fascinating because it doesn't read as pride. It reads as distance. Like she can feel herself turning into narrative before she's even emotionally finished living through the events themselves. That haunted me, because the series understands how quickly real human pain gets transformed into myth once history starts organizing itself around spectacle and power. But the show never forgets the human core underneath the myth. It remembers the sister forced into sacrifice, the mother surviving through compromise until compromise hollowed her out, the girl standing silently in rooms where her gift was treated like a threat instead of a miracle, the young woman learning power in isolation because society refused to let her possess it openly, the survivor returning home powerful enough to conquer and discovering conquest cannot resurrect lost years. That emotional continuity is what makes the series special. Even visually, the final episode keeps returning to faces rather than spectacle during crucial moments. People watching Eleanor watching them back. Recognition shifting into fear, admiration, grief, uncertainty. The drama understands that emotional consequences matter more than pure fantasy scale. And honestly, one of the bravest things the ending does is allow exhaustion to exist openly. Not triumphant exhaustion. Existential exhaustion. The kind that comes after surviving too many transformations too quickly. Eleanor carries that fatigue physically by the end. You can see it in the slower movements, the pauses before speaking, the moments where silence feels easier than explanation. The actress never loses sight of the psychological weight accumulating inside the character. There's this tiny detail in one of the final conversations where somebody asks Eleanor a question about the future. And before answering, she closes her eyes briefly, like the effort of imagining tomorrow has become emotionally difficult. Such a subtle performance choice. But it says everything about how survival consumed her life for so long that ordinary hope now feels unfamiliar. That absolutely wrecked me. Because beneath all the fantasy mechanics, this is still fundamentally a story about somebody denied the chance to grow naturally. Eleanor develops under pressure instead of freedom, under suppression instead of support. Her power becomes inseparable from the violence surrounding its emergence. The dragons themselves almost feel tragic by the end too. Not because they weaken, because they become symbols of a world that only listens once destruction enters the conversation. That idea runs quietly underneath the entire show. How many people could have lived differently if compassion arrived earlier than fear? And I think the series asks that question not just politically, but personally. Within families, within relationships, within identities. How much suffering could have been prevented if Eleanor had simply been believed in from the beginning? If her gift had been nurtured instead of hidden? If her anger had been heard before it became catastrophic? If the women in this world had not been taught survival through self-erasure? The tragedy is that by the time these questions become unavoidable, the damage is already historical. There's no clean reset available anymore. Only aftermath. Only rebuilding. Only memory. And maybe that's why the final emotional note hit me so hard. The show doesn't end by asking whether Eleanor became good or evil. It asks whether the world that created her could ever have produced a gentler outcome under the same conditions? That's a much more interesting question, and a much more painful one. I also need to say this. The series understands spectacle emotionally better than most fantasy television right now. The dragons aren't just cool visual assets. They represent emotional states too large for ordinary language. Rage that burns through generations. Grief becoming impossible to contain. Power refusing confinement anymore. Every major dragon moment means something psychologically. That's why the visuals stay with you. Not just because they're impressive, but because they're tied directly to character. One final flight sequence near the end, honestly, left me sitting in silence afterward. No huge victory speech. No exaggerated heroic framing. Just Ilyana suspended between sky and earth, between freedom and isolation, between myth and personhood. The score barely rises above this haunting ache underneath the wind. And for the first time in the series, she almost looks peaceful. Not healed. That's important. Not healed, but momentarily unburdened by performance. Like someone who finally stopped asking whether the world approved of her existence. That distinction feels like the entire emotional destination of the story. So yeah, I love this show. Not perfectly, because there are moments where pacing wobbles slightly and a few side characters could have used more development toward the middle stretch. There are occasional scenes where the political exposition edges close to overcomplication. And depending on your taste, the emotional heaviness may become exhausting rather than immersive. This is not easy comfort viewing fantasy. It's dense, bitter at times, introspective, more interested in emotional consequences than crowd-pleasing catharsis. But honestly, that's exactly why it worked for me. The daughter who commands dragon treats power seriously. It treats family damage seriously. It treats female rage seriously. It treats survival seriously. And most importantly, it treats emotional transformation as something complicated and often irreversible rather than aesthetically empowering. That gives the story weight. If you're looking for non-stop action and clean heroes, this may frustrate you. The show lives in ambiguity too often for that. But if you like fantasy that actually interrogates what power does to people psychologically, especially people denied humanity long before they gained authority, there's a lot here to sink into. And for newcomers especially, I'd say give the early episodes patience. The series builds emotionally before it explodes politically. The quieter family dynamics matter. The silences matter. The humiliation matters. Without that foundation, the later transformation wouldn't hit nearly as hard. For fans of darker fantasy dramas, though, this is absolutely one of the more emotionally intelligent entries I've seen in a while. Not because it's trying to look sophisticated, because it understands hurt. It understands how systems shape people slowly, how compromise corrodes families, how memory can become identity, how anger can feel righteous and dangerous simultaneously, how power gained too late still leaves scars behind. And Ilyana herself is just a fantastic central character. Messy, brilliant, wounded, frightening, lonely, tender in flashes, hardened in others, never fully reducible to a simple label. That's the kind of protagonist who lingers after the credits end. Weeks later, you're still thinking about certain expressions, certain silences, certain lines delivered almost too quietly. You made becoming necessary. I swear that line alone could summarize the entire emotional architecture of the show. Because ultimately, The Daughter Who Commands Dragon is about what happens when somebody's society tried to contain finally realizes containment was never moral to begin with. And once that realization fully ignites, dragons are honestly the least terrifying thing about her. If you made it this far with me on Flick Flare, subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. I genuinely love to hear where people land on Ilyana, because I think reactions to her are going to vary wildly depending on what experiences viewers bring into the story themselves. And honestly, that's usually the sign of a drama worth talking about.